February 1968. A small apartment in Harlem. Frankie Lymon's body was found on the bathroom floor, heroin needle still in his arm. 25 years old. The radio in the next room was playing oldies. Somewhere in the rotation, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The song that made him famous at 13. The song that was still making money, just not for him, not anymore. Not ever, really. That same month, 400 miles away in Gary, Indiana, a 9-year-old boy named Michael Jackson was rehearsing in his family's tiny living room. His father, Joe, stood in the corner, watching every move, counting every beat, correcting every mistake. Michael had been performing since he was 5. 4 years of stages, crowds, and pressure. 4 years of childhood traded for applause. He was already exhausted, already losing pieces of himself he didn't know he'd need later. But he was alive. And for the next 41 years, he would stay alive, even as everything inside him slowly died the same death that took Frankie Lymon in a Harlem bathroom. 2 boys, 2 geniuses, 15 years apart. Both would become the most famous voices of their generations. Both would lose their childhoods to music. Both would die too young, too alone, too broken. But one would get 25 years, the other would get 50. And the question that haunts both their stories is this: what did Michael Jackson survive that Frankie Lymon couldn't? Or did he really survive at all? Frankie Lymon was born in Harlem in 1942. Michael Jackson was born in Gary, Indiana in 1958. Different cities, different decades, but the same poverty, the same dream, the same parents who saw talent in their children and saw a way out. Frankie's father was a singer who never made it. Michael's father was a guitarist who never made it. Both men looked at their gifted sons and saw second chances, saw redemption, saw money. And in both cases, that vision would cost their sons everything. But genius doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't care if you're ready. Frankie could sing before he could read. Perfect pitch, natural rhythm, the kind of voice that makes people stop on the street and ask, "Where is that coming from?" By age 12, he was performing with a group called the Teenagers on Harlem corners, singing doo-wop for spare change. They were good, the kind of good that gets noticed. In 1955, talent scout Richard Barrett heard them outside the Apollo Theater and brought them to George Goldner's G Records. They recorded Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Frankie was 13. The song exploded, not just hit the charts, exploded. Number 1, R&B, top 10, pop. Crossed every racial line that usually kept music segregated in 1956 America. White teenagers bought it. Black teenagers bought it. It played on every radio station. Frankie Lymon, at 13 years old, became one of the most recognizable voices in the country. He appeared on television, toured nationally, signed autographs, screamed at by girls twice his age. He was a child, and the world treated him like a product. Michael Jackson's story started younger. 5 years old when Joe Jackson put him in front of an audience for the first time. The Jackson 5 wasn't formed yet. It was just the older brothers, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, practicing in the living room. But Joe noticed something about Michael. The youngest boy wasn't just keeping up with his older brothers. He was better than them. Sharper, more precise, more natural. At 5 years old, Michael could mimic James Brown's moves perfectly, could hit notes that shouldn't come out of a kindergartner's throat, could feel rhythm in a way that couldn't be taught. Joe Jackson saw dollar signs, but he also saw something else. He'd watched the music industry chew up and spit out talented black kids for decades. He'd seen what happened to child stars who had no protection, no structure, no one fighting for them. Joe was abusive, controlling, pushed his sons to psychological breaking points, made them rehearse until they bled, hit them when they missed steps, But in his own twisted way, Joe was trying to build something that would protect them from the industry that destroyed artists like Frankie Lymon. He just didn't realize he was becoming the thing he was trying to protect them from. By 1964, the Jackson 5 was performing in local talent shows. Michael was 6 years old, already the star, already carrying the weight. They won everything they entered, and that's when people started paying attention. Not just local attention, real attention. In 1967, they performed at the Apollo Theater Amateur Night, the same theater where Frankie Lymon had been discovered 12 years earlier. Michael was 9. He sang "I Got You" by James Brown. Destroyed it. The crowd went insane. For a 9-year-old to command a stage like that, to have that presence, that control, it was the kind of moment that changes trajectories. Backstage, industry people were already circling, already planning, already seeing product. But here's the crucial difference. Frankie Lymon was alone. The teenagers were his group, but they were all teenagers. No adults protecting them, no structure. Just kids and the adults who wanted to exploit them. When Frankie signed his first contract at 13, no one explained what he was signing. No one protected his interests. No one said, "Wait, this is a child. Maybe we should make sure he understands what he's giving away." They just handed him a pen and took everything. Michael Jackson had the Jackson 5, had his brothers, had Joe Jackson, who for all his abuse, understood contracts, understood exploitation, understood that the music industry saw black children as disposable. Joe was brutal, but he read every contract, questioned every clause, fought for his sons in ways no one had fought for Frankie. And when Berry Gordy and Motown came calling in 1968, Joe negotiated. Not perfectly. Motown still took advantage, but there was negotiation. There was structure. There was something resembling protection. Because by 1968, the industry had learned. Not morally, economically. They'd watched what happened to Frankie Lymon, watched a child star make millions for everyone except himself, then crash and burn by his early 20s. That was bad business. Dead artists don't make new music. Broken artists don't tour. The music executives had literally studied Frankie's case in boardrooms, analyzed where the system had failed not him, but their profit model. They'd seen how quickly a billion-dollar asset could self-destruct when given no support structure, no education, no financial literacy, no psychological care. Motown wasn't benevolent, but Berry Gordy understood that exploitation worked better when it was systematic. When artists survived long enough to produce decades of content instead of burning out in 5 years. So they built systems, education programs, financial management, chaperones, scheduled school time, not out of kindness, out of capitalism. But those systems gave Michael something Frankie never had: time. 1968 was the year everything changed for both of them. Frankie Lymon died in February. Michael Jackson signed with Motown in March. The boy who'd been the warning was gone. The boy who would carry that warning into the future was just beginning. But what nobody tells you about surviving longer is this: sometimes it just means suffering longer. The Jackson 5's first single, "I Want You Back," hit #1 in January 1970. Michael was 11 years old, already a veteran performer, already exhausted, already performing a version of childhood for cameras while having no actual childhood off stage. Motown marketed him as cute, innocent, pure, the boy next door who could sing like an angel. But behind the scenes, Michael was working adult hours, recording until midnight, rehearsing before school, performing on weekends. His entire life was managed, scheduled, controlled. He had no friends his own age, no normal experiences, no privacy, just cameras and stages and adults telling him what to do. Frankie Lymon had experienced the same thing 15 years earlier. 13 years old, touring the country, sleeping in hotels, surrounded by adults, no peers, no childhood. The difference was, Frankie had it worse and faster. No Motown machine, no educational requirements, no one pretending to care about his well-being, just pure exploitation. By age 15, Frankie was already using heroin, not because he was weak, because he was drowning. Because the pressure was unbearable and no one around him cared about anything except keeping him performing. Drugs were everywhere in the music scene. And when you're 15 years old with money and trauma and no supervision, drugs stop being a choice and start being inevitable. Michael made it longer, stayed clean in the traditional sense through his teenage years. But the pressure was building, the control was suffocating. Joe's abuse didn't stop just because they were famous. It got worse. Michael later described being so terrified of his father that he would vomit before seeing him. Described beatings, described psychological torture, described having no childhood, no normalcy, no escape. The Jackson 5 was successful. Michael was the star. But success didn't mean safety. It just meant prettier packaging on the same trauma. By the time Michael was 13, the same age Frankie had been when Why Do Fools Fall in Love made him famous, Michael had already been performing for 8 years. 8 years of stages, 8 years of adults controlling every aspect of his life. 8 years of being told he was special, chosen, different. 8 years of losing pieces of himself he wouldn't realize were gone until it was too late. But he had something Frankie didn't. He was still part of a group, still had his brothers, still had people who understood what he was going through because they were going through it too. That wouldn't last forever, but for those crucial teenage years, Michael wasn't alone. Frankie was alone by 16. The teenagers fell apart. The hits stopped coming. The crowds disappeared. And suddenly, Frankie Lymon was just a kid who used to be famous. Except he wasn't just a kid. He was a drug addict with no money, no skills, no education, and no idea who he was without applause. He tried comebacks. Tried new groups, tried going solo. Nothing worked, because the industry moves fast, and it doesn't wait for child stars to figure themselves out. By 18, Frankie was forgotten. By 25, he was dead. Michael made it to 50, but the same demons that killed Frankie were chasing him the entire time. When Michael went solo in 1971, still technically part of the Jackson 5, but increasingly the focus, he stepped into the same trap that had destroyed Frankie. Solo meant alone. Solo meant all the pressure on one person. Solo meant if you break, everything breaks. Thriller made Michael the biggest star in the world. Sold more albums than anyone in history. Made him immortal. But immortality has a price, and Michael paid it the same way Frankie did, with his identity, his peace, his childhood, and eventually his life. Both men became addicted. Frankie to heroin, Michael to prescription drugs. Different substances, same escape, same inability to sleep without chemical help, same need to numb the constant pressure. Frankie's addiction was street-level, visible, criminalized. Michael's was medicalized, prescribed, enabled by doctors who saw him as a paycheck. But the mechanism was identical. A child star who never learned how to be human, trying to shut off the pain the only way available. Both men struggled with identity. Frankie didn't know who he was without the stage, spent his final years trying to recapture something that had never really been his to begin with. The teenage fame was a costume he'd been forced to wear, and when it was taken away, there was nothing underneath. He'd never had time to develop a self separate from the performance. Never learned who Frankie Lymon was when the music stopped. Michael didn't know who he was without the performance. Built Neverland Ranch as a physical manifestation of the childhood he'd lost. Filled it with rides and animals and everything a child should have experienced. But you can't go backward. can't reclaim what was stolen in real time. Michael tried to recapture his lost childhood for decades, tried to build a parallel universe where he could be the boy he never got to be. Both were chasing something that never existed. Frankie's teenage fame was exploitation packaged as success. Michael's childhood was stolen before it began. You can't recapture what you never had, but both of them died trying. Both men died alone. Frankie in a bathroom in Harlem, 25 years old, with a needle in his arm. Michael in a bedroom in Los Angeles, 50 years old, with propofol in his system, separated by 41 years, 400 miles, and millions of dollars. But the loneliness was identical. Millions of people loved them, screamed for them, bought their music. But in the end, both died surrounded by people who saw them as products, not humans. Both died with their real selves buried so deep under the performance that maybe even they couldn't find it anymore. The cruelest part of Michael's story is that he knew. He knew what happened to Frankie Lymon, knew what happened to child stars who got chewed up by the industry. In interviews, Michael talked about it. Talked about how he studied the careers of artists who came before him. Talked about trying to avoid their mistakes. He saw the warning. Understood the danger, built more protections than Frankie ever had better contracts, better lawyers, more control. And it didn't matter, because the fundamental problem wasn't contracts or lawyers, it was being a child in an adult industry. And once that damage is done, it doesn't unhappen. Frankie Lymon was the blueprint, the cautionary tale, the warning that everyone in the industry knew about and ignored. Motown saw what happened to Frankie and built systems to prevent it. Not out of morality, out of profit. But those systems gave Michael more time. Not more peace, not more happiness, just more time. 25 more years of surviving in a system designed to consume him. When Michael died in 2009, the world mourned. Tributes, memorials, millions of people claiming they'd lost a piece of their childhood. But Michael had lost his childhood long before they did, lost it the same way Frankie lost his. Given it away, or had it taken, in exchange for making other people happy, in exchange for applause, in exchange for being special. There's no major difference between their tragedies. Just the length. Frankie got 25 years. Michael got 50. Both spent those years trapped. Both spent them performing. Both spent them losing themselves. The only question is whether getting more time in the trap is actually surviving, or just a longer death. Because survival implies escape, implies finding a way out, implies freedom. Neither of them escaped. Neither of them found freedom. Michael just stayed in the cage longer, had more years to understand exactly how trapped he was, more decades to feel the weight of what had been taken from him. Sometimes 25 years of suffering is more merciful than 50. Frankie Lymon and Michael Jackson never met. Couldn't have. Frankie died when Michael was 9. But their lives were the same life, separated by 15 years and a few policy changes that didn't fix the fundamental problem. The problem that child stars are children. And children can't protect themselves from industries designed to profit from their destruction. Why Do Fools Fall in Love still plays on oldies stations. Thriller still sells. Both voices are immortal. Both legacies are secure. But the people behind those voices never got to be people. They were products from the beginning, products that eventually broke down, one faster than the other, but both in exactly the same way. Michael Jackson survived what Frankie Lymon couldn't. Except survival isn't the right word. Michael just lasted longer before the same ending found him.